Now that I've got a simulation actually working and at the correct time base and the correct space and everything, then I can start playing around with some of the rigid body attributes. I can select one, go into the channel box and highlight that rigid body node and play around with some of these things. Like, for example, I've got friction. Let's try increasing the friction on these. And you might notice, by the way, that sometimes Maya is a little bit buggy about stuff and it might not take the first time. So you might have to do some kind of funky things like maybe move these around a little bit, maybe move these up off the floor a bit, just by a tiny fraction of an inch there. And that might resolve some issues. So now it's working correctly. If I do that now, when I select this and play it back, you'll notice that it's not moving. It's because I've increased the friction. That was a little bit funky. I had to actually move my objects off the floor to get them to kind of work correctly. Going back into the channel box, I can then play around with the static and dynamic friction and maybe try to get that into the range that I'm trying to achieve. Okay, rewind, maybe 0.5. That's better. So there are two friction attributes. They're static and dynamic. Static friction is a force that needs to be overcome in order for an object to start moving from a resting position. And dynamic friction is the force that needs to be overcome to stop an object that's in motion. Usually you set them both to be the same. Rewind that up here. And so I've got the correct amount of friction that I was going for. Now you notice this one's jittering a lot over here, and that sometimes does happen with Maya's rigid bodies, and it's nothing to be alarmed about. It's actually kind of common. And we could play around with that and try to correct that in our solver settings, but as we'll see, it's actually easier just to convert this to keyframes and then just delete those errant motions there. You're going to have to convert this to keyframes anyway, once you get the motion that you want. You can just play around with this a little bit more, like, for example, select the sphere and scroll down, maybe increase the bounciness. It ranges between 0 and 1, and the ground plane has a bounciness as well. I'll leave that one at the default of 0.6. Maybe I'll increase the bounciness of these as well. Bring those up to, let's say, 0.8. Rewind and play back, so that's looking kind of cool. You'll notice that I've got this that they're falling a little bit. Maybe I can move them down a little bit. Maybe I'll hit the space bar and go into one of the ortho views and move them down just a little bit so they're not quite touching, so we don't notice that. In our next exercise with the catapult, we'll learn how to set the initial states so that they don't move at all. Okay, so if I'm happy with this, I probably want to save it at this stage, because the next thing I do is going to be a destructive act. I'm actually going to end up deleting all my rigid body nodes and converting all this motion into actual standard, ordinary raw keyframes. Before I do that, I want to save scene as, and I've already got one here. I'm just going to overwrite it, but I'm saving it as Dynamics Demo Unbaked. In other words, this is still a dynamic simulation, and I can still go in and change all the attributes like bounciness and friction and positions of objects and so on. Now that I've saved the document in its unbaked form, I'm ready to bake the simulation. I'll select the 3 objects that are moving. I don't need to create keyframes on any unmoving objects. And I'll just go into the Edit menu and go to Keys, Bake Simulation. And by default, it'll do the entire timeline. I can go into the option box if I needed to change that. So click Bake Simulation. It'll play through once, and you'll notice that for all the moving objects, I've got now a keyframe on every single frame. And now I can actually scrub in the timeline. So that's an improvement. I've converted that simulation to keyframes. However, the rigid body nodes are still hanging out in my scene. You'll see them here in the shapes. So they're actually still being calculated. And really, to clean this up, I need to delete them. So I'll go back to the menus. I'll go Edit, Delete All by Type, Rigid Bodies. And now those are gone, but I've still got some static channels, like, for example, these scale channels. Those aren't even animated. So I want to just get rid of all of the channels that have keyframes but don't have any changes in value, or static channels, just to sort of do some garbage collection here. I'll clean that up. Go to the Edit menu, delete all by type, static channels. And now as I go around and select these things, you'll notice that the scale and visibility channels have got no orange channel highlighting, meaning that there's no incoming curve there. Okay, so I can scrub through here, and I can even edit. Once this has been converted to keyframes, I can just select an object and, modify its keyframes in the usual way. So for example, I've got this jitter here that starts to come in around frame 30. Just select that object, shift select these keys, right click, and delete. And now I've just deleted that animation. It comes to a nice halt there. I can even go in and edit this in the graph editor. I can go to Window, Animation Editor's Graph Editor. We're looking at all the channels for the cone. Notice that there is a keyframe on every frame, but this is pretty great because I can just select these curves and then in the graph editor menu choose Curves, Simplify Curve. And it does a pretty good job of cleaning up the curves and reducing the amount of information there. You'll notice that it may produce kind of bumps. We might want to actually just convert these now to spline, and that'll kind of sort that out. It's great because you can clean up animation after it's been baked. And finally, I'll go and save the scene as to a baked version. And I do need to do this baking process. It's not optional, because if you don't, when you go to render the animation, you may get unpredictable results. And it'll also take a lot longer because it'll have to calculate the simulation on every rendered frame. So you have to bake the simulation. Otherwise, you're going to get garbage results when you try to render. So that's the essential workflow for rigid body dynamics in Maya.